Get ready to rumble. Shilling Show Unleashed on the Seven Thunders Media Network. Former city councilor, husband, father, and community watchdog. Your host, Rob Schilling.
Welcome to the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Remember, your direct support makes our show possible, and you can directly support this podcast by visiting shillingshow.com and then clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page to make a monthly contribution. We appreciate your support. Dr. Seuss. Yes, you heard me right, banning Dr. Seuss, the generation of books that was beloved by people across America for a couple of generations, has now gotten on the progressives' ban list. You know, they started with things like Little House on the Prairie for negative depictions of Native Americans, Peter Pan, even Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer in the last couple Christmases has been banned by some television stations. Some of the famous Christmas songs, Baby It's Cold Outside. Oh, these are all problematic in today's woke society. So when I received the news that 6 of Dr. Seuss's classic books were being banned, taken off the market, the publishing being stopped, I wasn't necessarily surprised, but I was very, very sad about it. He's a brilliant writer and has entertained our family for hours. I read these books to the kids over a course of a number of years, and even sometimes still, my kids like to hear the Dr. Seuss books. They're whimsical, they're nonsensical, they're fun. The characters that he creates, sometimes hard to tell even what they are. They're just parts of his imagination expressed with a pen and paper. In looking at all of the criticism of this, I have to think about characters versus caricatures. And so a character is just somebody in a book or a story. A caricature would be taking a person or a character and exaggerating some features, whether that's in how they act or how they look. The biggest complaint here is that Dr. Seuss is using quote-unquote stereotypes. Well, what is a stereotype? A stereotype is something that is boiled down. In other words, if you just said, what could I say to describe something very briefly, that in essence would be a stereotype. You're not going to take a lot of time talking about all the different facets and features of something, but really just what is essential about it. So the stereotypes that are used in Dr. Seuss's books that are being criticized here, an Asian man with chopsticks or an African man on display they wanted to put in a zoo because it was something that was odd or unusual. We used to have circuses that went around the country and they would display things that were oddities. And I think when you're looking at these books at that time, these cultures were very foreign to the United States of America by and large, and they intrigued us. We had lots of movies that showed maybe some similar stereotypes, if you want to use that word, but I would rather call them just oddities that people look at and say, well, that's kind of what I think people in that area look like, or those are the sorts of things they do. I don't necessarily see anything wrong with that. And I say that because I ask the question, are non-ethnic characters drawn any differently? Are there quote-unquote stereotypes of people who might live in different parts of America, people from the country, people from the city? And the next question is, how would other cultures portray a typical American, if there is such a thing, in their children's books? I'm sure there are stereotypes of Americans all over the world. Would anybody really care? Do Americans care if they go to another country, say to China, and there are stereotypes of Americans in Chinese children's books or in Africans' children's books? Who really cares? Now, if you look at all of this and they're pulling the Dr. Seuss books, what are the books that they're replacing them with? Well, here's one, Not Your Sidekick. It features LGBT-friendly magic schools. The Prince and the Dressmaker, about a prince who secretly wears dresses at night. And Julian is a Mermaid, a little boy who sees women dressed as mermaids and then wants to dress just like they dress. How about this one? Americanized, Rebel Without a Green Card, about an illegal immigrant from Iran. And I wonder if this person came to America because he loves America or he despises America and wants to change it. You see, if the first act of arriving in America is breaking the law, that's not really a good start. It is ironic that not so long ago, maybe within the past 5 or 6 years, former First Lady Michelle Obama was reading Dr. Seuss to groups of kids, and she said, "We love Dr. Seuss in this house." Even President Barack Obama said pretty much all the stuff you need to know is in Dr. Seuss. The great concern that we all should look at right now is where this leads us, because we're moving into a society where only government-sanctioned art, like movies, books, music, will be allowed, and everything else is banned. And if you're in possession of these banned items, well, you could be punished. This is the Soviet system or the communist Chinese system, and I think we're heading in that direction. It is a complete erosion of the First Amendment. In other words, you may have the ability to express yourself, but only if the government approves of what you say. We're seeing decreasing and not increasing tolerance. And for all of these people that want to get rid of these books in the name of tolerance because they're saying the books themselves are intolerant, they are displaying the highest level of intolerance by banning things and shaming people who enjoy them. In today's America, Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451 and George Orwell's 1984 have become a reality. I never thought I'd see the day, but they saw it coming. And I have to wonder, how long until those are banned? The Schilling Show Unleashed podcast continues in a moment.
Online at shillingshow.com.
BorderHawk.news is a one-stop shop with the latest news about immigration, nationalism, and globalism. The BorderHawk staff daily curates immigration news stories and, in the fashion of the Drudge Report, updates the site with cutting-edge content and original first-class commentary. BorderHawk.news highlights national and international media reports, tweets, and nuggets buried in local news blurbs, polls, video clips, and policy research. BorderHawk is pro-legal immigration, pro-rule of law, but against an unsecure border as countless Americans have suffered violence at the hands of criminal illegal aliens. And an increasing number of Americans are concerned about how mass migration affects their daily life. BorderHawk.news will remain on the forefront of the immigration issue with a buffet of info to read, evaluate, and share. Bookmark BorderHawk.news. Add them on social media at BorderHawkNews on Twitter.
Schilling Show Unleashed.
The Schilling Show Unleashed podcast continues, and we welcome Joshua Mitchell, professor of political theory at Georgetown University and author of American Awakening, Identity Politics, and Other Afflictions of Our Time. And Josh Mitchell, welcome to the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast.
Thanks, Rob, for having me.
I want to start out with the word awakening because that takes us back to a previous era. Are we experiencing another sort of awakening in the way that we have in America previously?
Yes. In the 1760s and the 1820s and 30s, we had what were known as the First and Second Great Awakenings. And my argument is that during those periods, everybody was consumed with the question of purity and stain. And I think what we've had now, or what we're in the midst of right now, is another great awakening where everybody's concerned with purity and stain. And so racism is the concern, misogyny is the concern, fuels, clean green fuels and dirty fossil fuels. So we're fixated on purity and stain and cleanliness, but this time we have no theological way of dealing with it. And so I characterize us as being in the moment of a great American awakening without God and without forgiveness.
So that sounds like a dangerous situation, and I've often considered what we see going on around us and wonder if it is a product of a nation that has too much time on its hands. In other words, when we were consumed with what we were going to eat for the day and being tired at the end of the day, we didn't have time for a lot of this.
Yes, so in the book I distinguish two possibilities. One is what I call the identity politics of innocence and transgression, and the other is what I call the liberal politics of competence, and that's, I think, what you're talking about. You know, for example, before the end of the Cold War, we understood that we were in competition with a foreign power. We didn't have time for the kind of, I don't want to call it navel gazing, but the concerns for kind of bringing about an end of history and cleaning up all the injustices of the world. We had competition. The world was not particularly clean, but we had to live in that kind of world. And my argument is that after 1989, when we ceased to have a power that was opposing us, we decided that we would live at the end of history, not in the way that Fukuyama had in mind, but what we're going to do is settle all the distant scores, which is why identity politics is always looking back at past transgressions, and it has no way for us to move forward. And my argument is we have to move forward. We have to build a world together. None of us are pure. And so we need to put down this identity politics and return to the world of competence.
When you talk about liberal competence and liberal citizenship in the book, Josh Mitchell, tell us a little bit more about what you mean, because the term liberal has changed over the years in its definition.
And that's a good point. That's one of the things I'm trying to do in the book, is I'm trying to pull us out of the categories that we have. So we think that liberal is left, and then there's conservative. So we set up a kind of binodal set of possibilities. And I'm saying there are three possibilities. One is the left, which I think is very, very dangerous because it wants to overcome the current state of things and has since the French Revolution. It's not that I'm against conservatism. I am in many ways very conservative. But my worry about the conservative movement in general, it looks back with too much of a bright eye to the past and to tradition. And my argument is that the tradition is mixed. It's always, partly beautiful and partly stained. And this is, of course, a Christian idea, going right back to the idea that once Adam and Eve sinned, the world of time is going to be a little bit blotted out. So my argument is that we have to live in a partially broken world. And so I depart in a way with conservatives because I think we have to acknowledge, for example, in the American context, that race was a problem. It didn't systematically taint America, but the slavery issue is an agony that Americans have to live through, and we have to find constructive ways to deal with that, and I believe there are.
Well, let's talk about that issue first and foremost, because it seems to be taking up a lot of the bandwidth in the national conversation.
I remind you that 2 years ago, during the Kavanaugh hearings, the only thing that people were concerned with was the so-called problem of misogyny, which is hatred of women and abuse of women. And so stain was understood in those terms. In the last couple of years, with Trump in the White House, the left has decided that they're going to paint him and America as a whole as racist. And so racism is now the thing that's on our mind. You can be assured, now that the Democrats have won the White House, that they're going to push that issue aside, and the new concern with stain is going to be climate change. You can see this already with the kinds of bills that the Democrats are putting forth. But with respect to race, let's talk about this for a bit. My view is that instead of declaring that we have collective guilt, I think we need to say we have collective responsibility for the least among us. By that phrase, I mean to include blacks who are still struggling in the aftermath, I think, frankly, of the welfare state, which has harmed them immensely. But there is a legacy that we have to work through, and I think there's a constructive way to do this. So I work very closely with Bob Woodson in the Woodson Center, and he and a number of people put together something called 1776 Unites. And our argument is that America is not irredeemably stained, that in fact we do have a legacy of slavery, but we also have these extraordinary stories of success and what Bob calls radical grace in the black community and also in poor white communities. And that the way that we should address the problems of the least among us is to go into those communities and find the people who have made these miraculous transformations of their lives and those around them and support them. So in other words, we do this largely through charity and private philanthropy rather than the state apparatus growing stronger and stronger and stronger, which is what the left wants to do. The left declares that America is systemically racist. Well, what's the political implication of that? The political implication of that is you can't help yourself. Your families can't help you. Your churches can't help you, and your neighborhoods can't help you. Only the state can help you. And so, in effect, the claim of systemic racism allows the left to double down on the idea of ever more government programs which employ larger and larger numbers and balloon the federal deficit.
So, Josh Mitchell, this is creating a nation of dependence. And it's very curious to me that this is even promoted within the church, and I want to talk about the black church right now, is this inability in some instances to see that government is not God and that that's not where the solution is. So how do we get past that? How do we, even in the church, across the board, figure out that the church is supposed to be doing a lot of this work that the government has assumed?
it's supposed to be doing double work. And one aspect is the one that you're talking about, which is charity. The great battle in America today is over what the churches are to be doing. And my argument is this problem of identity politics is ultimately not going to be solved in the realm of politics. The categories of transgression and innocence are theological categories. And what I argue in the book is that identity politics only emerged after the collapse of the mainline churches in the aftermath of the Vietnam War. And of course, the Catholic churches went soft as well. And what I mean by that is that in both cases, they lost sight of this profound Christian insight, namely that all of us are stained by virtue of Adam's transgression. So original sin was what we understood once to be the key to the churches, but we also understood that sin was something that everybody had, and that only through the sacrifice of a divine scapegoat, and I'll talk about the scapegoat in a moment, only through the sacrifices of a divine scapegoat could man be saved. Well, what happened was as the churches went soft, the category of stain did not disappear. It migrated into politics. The Pew Charitable Trust has done studies which are now famous about how so many Americans now declare that they are nuns, that is to say they have no religious affiliation. And I suggest that these polls are looking in the wrong place and asking the wrong question. Americans today are as consumed with the idea of transgression and stain as they ever have been, except the churches have abandoned their charge of helping people work that through in a theological way. And now that's being worked through in politics. So young people today are able to think very deeply about transgression and stain, but they do it through identity politics rather than in the churches. And it's only when the churches return to their primordial insight, which is that man is broken and requires divine assistance to heal, that we can get things squared away. But instead what we have is, instead of a divine scapegoat, which is what the churches declare, Christ is the one sufficient sacrifice. Instead what we've done, or what identity politics has done, has identified a scapegoat, a mortal scapegoat, and that right now is the white heterosexual male. And if you look at every major action item in the Democratic Party, from getting rid of the nation state, from getting rid of the borders, attack on capitalism, attack on the patriarchal church, attack on the patriarchal family, really the subtext of all this, or what all this points to, is that there's one prime transgressor, and that's the white heterosexual male. And if we can simply scapegoat and purge him, everything will be well. So whereas Christianity declares that there's a divine scapegoat for all of us, identity politics declares that the white heterosexual male is the scapegoat who, if we purge, will take away the sins of the world and the world will be pure again. This is what identity politics is up to. This is why the Democratic Party attacks all those things that are linked to the white heterosexual male.
But you also mentioned in the book that some of the major spokespeople for the Democratic Party, people like Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders, they are old white males. So when does the internal purge begin, or has it already?
Well, this is a wonderful question. And of course, the quick answer is the purge will occur, but you have to ask exactly your question now. So why is it then that the people who seem to be running the show are these white heterosexual males? And I think the answer is a very interesting one. You might recall that in the Old Testament, there's the Passover. And the Passover is where death passes over, provided that you paint the blood of an innocent lamb on your lintel, and then death will pass over. Well, identity politics has an equivalent. And what you have to do if you're a white heterosexual male is you have to demonstrate in everything that you do that you side with the innocents. And so of course you have to hate Donald Trump and all his supporters. That's the first and most important thing you have to do. If you distance yourself from those white people, you're not that kind of a white man. But then, of course, you have to have signs on your office door that say, this office is green. You have to have Black Lives Matter posters in your front yard. You have to look for some kind of cover of innocence so that social death, i.e. canceling, passes you by. And so white people, certain kinds of white people can get a pass provided that they double down on this identity politics. That's why the strongest Black Lives Matter supporters are not black, they're white. Because white people, guilty white people, and Shelby Steele has written extensively about the pathology of guilty white people. Guilty white people need to cover their transgression, cover their stain of being white by doubling down on projects of innocence. And that's exactly what's happening with Black Lives Matter today.
And so we've seen this manifesting itself right here in Charlottesville at the University of Virginia, where there was a white professor who owned a restaurant in town and had the audacity to make a comment about Black Lives Matter, that he thought it was a racist organization, and the whole world came down on him. He eventually lost his position at the University of Virginia. He eventually lost his restaurant here in Charlottesville, and I don't think he can show his face in town. And again, to put an exclamation point on what you said, Josh, the loudest screamers in many cases were the white college students, and many of them white females.
Yeah, I haven't quite figured out the white female part. I'm sure it's relevant. I'm just not exactly sure. I can't explain how it is. But if you look at the words that are being thrown about today by identity politics, they're all scapegoat words. Fascist, Nazi, hater, denier, Islamophobe, homophobe, misogynist, and more recently, insurrectionist. These are words not intended to build a world together, but intended to purge. And Black Lives Matter, BLM, is one of these signifier words of scapegoating. So if you support Black Lives Matter, then you have the cover of innocence. If you have the slightest doubt about whether Black Lives Matters help Black people, then you're going to be purged. And this is why Bob Woodson's work in the Woodson Center is so important, because all of us who are working with Bob recognize that there are real problems that we have to face. And so we have to have constructive ways of dealing with the least among us. But Black Lives Matter signs aren't going to help. So where I live, and I'm not going to indicate the small town, it's a small college town. Largely, a lot of white liberals have moved from other places to be here. And there's a gigantic BLM sign painted right down the main street. And the main street is only a couple hundred yards long. And I go there and I think to myself, this is not really about helping blacks. This is about white people putting a sign out which gives them the cover of innocence so that social death will pass over. And so my criticism of Black Lives Matter is not that the concern isn't real. That, yes, of course we have to be concerned with Black people and other people and the legacy of slavery. Here's where I probably depart with some of my conservatives. I do believe that there's a legacy of slavery that we have to address constructively. But Black Lives Matter is not about that. It gives white people a cover of innocence on the basis of which they can then go home at night and say, hey, I'm fine. There's nothing to do. I painted a Black Lives Matter sign down the main street of my town. My criticism ultimately is that these kinds of what I call innocent signaling, it's not virtue signaling, it's innocence. We have to keep it in its biblical category. This innocent signaling allows people to do nothing. And so in a way, I'm more radical than the Black Lives Matter folks, or many of them, the white ones, because I'm arguing we actually have to do something. And innocent signaling isn't going to save the world here.
I'd like to go very briefly to journalism because it may seem like a small point, but I took note in your book that the word black was not capitalized. I've noticed virtually every other publication in America, this has happened in the last 6 months, that the word black is capitalized, the word white is never capitalized. And does that have anything to do with identity politics?
Well, this is very interesting. So the editor that I worked with insisted that Hispanic be capitalized, but not black. Now, what's happened, as you say, in the last 6 months is without a single conversation, black has been capitalized and white is not. So you can see the subtle hints here that these are protected categories. And I'm very nervous about having protected categories. I should say something a bit autobiographical, which I mentioned in the book. So half of my family comes from Lebanon. If the Obama presidency had continued, so to speak, with Hillary Clinton, it's very likely that MENA, people of Middle Eastern and North African descent, would also be capitalized, and I would have protected status. And I think about my Lebanese immigrants who came over, relatives who came over in the 1890s. It would have been inconceivable for them to come over and believe that they were a protected category. These protections don't ultimately help. What you need to do is offer every kind of encouragement and set up your society so that the least among us can rise. But to give them protected status does not help them. It oftentimes gives those who give them protected status a kind of meaning for their life, and therefore they need these people to be eternal dependents in order to have meaning in their own lives. And this is really a tragedy for both parties.
We talk about both parties, and you spend a good amount of time in the book on the impact of identity politics on both political parties, and I'd like to get a little deeper into that, particularly to the Republican Party, because we talked a lot about the Democrats, but what has happened and what does the Republican Party do going forward regarding identity politics?
I'm actually critical of the Republican Party in the book. I do believe that that Reaganism, with its understanding that market efficiency is an adequate criteria on the basis of which to establish social policy, I think that was a mistake. The irony here, I mean, I haven't written about this much, but I'm going to write more about it. The irony is this. In the Reagan era, conservatives tried to find one measure, a measure on the basis of which they could cut through all the fog and say, this is how we need to understand society. The irony here is that identity politics is doing the same sort of thing, but in a different way. Instead of looking at money and market efficiency as the universal way to look at human beings and clear away all the fog, they're giving people identity categories and establishing their relative hierarchy, what I call their spiritual eugenics, on the basis of their intersectionality score. And so I have objections to both ideas because human beings can't be reduced to a number. Human goodness can't be reduced to market efficiency. And so I think conservatives have a great deal to answer for. And what's interesting about the new conservative movement, the kind of post-Bush, post-Reagan conservative movement, and I'm actually part of this, is that it does not believe that market efficiency is the highest good. It is very wary about endless foreign wars abroad. So I think these things are very, very good. My concern, though, is that so many people on the right have no idea how to deal with identity politics. And the confirmation of this is that you still hear the claim that this is cultural Marxism or multiculturalism. It reflects a kind of tone deafness to what's really going on here. In the book, I say that there are two economies. There's the economy of the world of payment, as I say. It's money, and conservatives understand that. But there's this other spiritual economy where things don't quite balance. And this is what Christianity tries to address, is that good people suffer, and we don't know why. Bad people go ahead, and we don't know why. And Christianity says there's in the spiritual economy, things don't quite balance out. It's not like the world of payment. And so conservatives who have adopted this kind of Reagan free market idea are very attentive to what I call the world of payment, but they don't understand this other world of the spiritual payment, so to speak, where the task is purity and stain and things don't quite work out in the world of time and God promises to resolve it at the end of time. The way this plays out, very interestingly, is in the New Green Deal. So conservatives look at AOC and they say, $50 trillion, that's just silly, because they're looking at the world of payment. Now, I'm not defending this, but AOC and the left is looking at a different kind of economy. It's the spiritual economy of cleanliness and filth. And so they think the New Green Deal, that economy is more important than the moneyed economy. And as you indicated earlier, we're living in this really weird time where the moneyed economy doesn't matter. The most important economy that matters is your standing in the spiritual economy, which is why, I mean, yes, you can be very critical of Trump for ballooning the federal deficit, but you can be sure under the Biden administration, which is concerned with this other kind of calculus, that we're going to spend trillions of dollars on the New Green Deal and do it for ideological reasons. We're going to spend trillions of dollars to get rid of, quote, systemic racism, because that's the economy that the left is concerned about. And my criticism of the right is that it is misunderstood that this other economy actually matters. Finally, my criticism of the left is not that it's working with the categories of purity and stain. My criticism of the left is that it doesn't understand what to do with them properly. And the proper thing to do is to put them back into their full Christian context so that we can actually work through transgression and innocence in the theological framework and not in the political framework. That's why, to return to what I said earlier, it's the churches where this has to be fixed. Politics can't fix this problem. It's deeper than politics.
So if we have a divide in the churches, and I think we're seeing that now, where there's a lot of churches, at least here in this college town, that are promoters of unbiblical marriage, promoters even of abortion. And then you have the other churches, the mainline churches, and those would include a lot of black churches, which disagree with the sexual politics. How does the church solve a problem when the church itself is very divided?
That's a great question. And black churches are the interesting ones to watch, and I wish people would do more studies of this. I I don't have the capacity and the bandwidth right now to do this, but I know for fact, in talking with Bob and other black intellectuals, that there's more of a balance in the black churches. There's still a lot of black churches with very conventional understandings about the sin and brokenness of man and the redemption that's promised by God in the future. The Martin Luther King 1963 speech is paradigmatic of that. I might not get there with you. We live in a broken world, but someday we're getting to the promised land. So there's that strain is still very much alive in the black churches and much less alive in the white churches, if you want to use that phrase. We're literally going to have a real awakening. We're going to need to have a real awakening if we're going to fix this problem. And what I mean by that is we're going to have to realize that we can't just look at people by their identity category and say, well, you're guilty, you're innocent. What we have to realize is that even after you do the purge, even after you scapegoat this group and then subsequently of that group and another one after that, you're still going to feel this inner stain. And to come to the deepest theological reason why this has happened is that Christianity declares both the God of judgment and the God of love. But what's happened is that the churches have all gone soft, and they're not willing to declare the God of judgment anymore. The God of judgment would say, you are a sinner. And instead, we want the God of love who's accepting, which is why you've got the BLM signs and the rainbow flags out in front of every church these days, because God is love. God accepts you just the way you are. That is not true. God does not accept you just the way you are. God knows that you're broken, and he wants you to return to him. And until we get back to that stage where we understand that the God of judgment is also involved, there's no hope for the redemption of the churches, so to speak.
Let's talk finally, Joshua Mitchell, about your hope for the future of America. Do you have it? And if so, where does it lie?
It's strange, but I do. And this is a very, very dark moment. We're living in a kind of Salem witch trial moment where everybody's trying to scapegoat the impure ones. Yes, of course I'm worried about that, but I would be more worried if we've reached a post-Christian moment where we give up entirely on the categories of purity and stain. And there was an author in the 1870s to 1890s, who's really the founder of the postmodern movement, which is Friedrich Nietzsche, who actually wanted that. His argument was that the Western civilization cannot renew itself until it finally renounces all of the Christian categories. And what he wanted to do was to renounce them and return to what he thought was the healthiest of human situations, which could be characterized as an aristocracy of cruelty in which the only categories are strength or weakness. This was, the distorted dream of the Nazis, but you have to understand what they were trying to do. They thought they were following Nietzsche, who was going to finally get rid of these categories of innocence and transgression, which is why the Germans wanted to attack Christendom. They hated the churches. So the bad news is that we've got a deeply distorted understanding of transgression and innocence being played out in identity politics. The good news is that millions of Americans are still very much concerned with understanding the world in terms of purity and stain. I'll take that. I can work with that. If we had actually come to the point where we were rejecting those categories, then I would be terrified. So it's a very dark moment, but as I said, it's an American awakening without God and without forgiveness. But at least it is an awareness that purity and stain matter as categories. And that means we can pull people back to a deeper understanding of how we can grapple with transgression and innocence.
Joshua Mitchell, if people want to get a copy of your book, American Awakening, Identity Politics, and Other Afflictions of Our Time, tell us how they can do that.
I know you can get it from Encounter Books. You might order it from your local bookstore. I'm a firm believer in localism. And if you must, you can order it from Amazon as well.
And if people want to follow you online and your work, how do they do that?
Well, this is a large issue itself. I don't do social media for deeply philosophical reasons. I think we have to return. This is what I deal with in the second part of the book, by the way. I think we must return to embedded communities. We have to do everything we possibly can to return to localism. This is not a claim that we reject technology, but rather that technology is a supplement to our local embodied life, and not a substitute for it. And as I say in the second and third parts of the book, this is actually a large problem as well, that we're turning things which should be supplements into substitutes. And this is why, even though we have this immense power at our fingertips, there's a tremendous hunger in American society right now, and people don't know how to sate it.
Well stated. Joshua Mitchell, thank you so much for joining us today on the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast.
My pleasure.
That concludes another edition of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Visit us online at shillingshow.com, where you can directly support this podcast by clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page and making a monthly donation. Your support is essential for the continuation of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Until next time.